But now let's take a look at one way of bringing more housing back into ownership. We're talking about empty homes. Helen Drew reports.
The South East has some of the country's most expensive housing, to rent and to buy. Demand for affordable housing is unsurprisingly high. The population is growing and house building rates are at their lowest since the 1920s. South East house prices have risen 3 times faster than incomes over the past decade. The average home in the region now costs 11 times more than the average local income. And roughly 1 in 17 South East families is on waiting lists for social housing. The government has recently put £100 million into bringing empty homes back into use as part of their National Affordable Housing Programme. This is significant because in Kent and East Sussex there are nearly 63,000 families on housing waiting lists, but there are 33,000 empty houses. Take Thanet as an example. Their waiting list for affordable housing would take the longest to clear of any area in Kent. There are over 4,500 households on the waiting list, but there are also 3,200 properties sitting empty. Kent County Council runs a scheme called No Use Empty, using some of the government's funding to try to alleviate this problem. The scheme gives developers interest-free loans to turn empty or derelict properties into livable accommodation. One example is this building in Margate. Once finished, it will house people from the council's waiting list. But before being given a no-use empty loan, the developer was short of funds.
I probably would have had to either sell the properties or if I'd carried on, I would have run out of money, gone broke. I suspect the properties would have fallen back into that gap, of developer gap, because probably no one would wanted to continue with the project, and they may well have gone back empty again. But fortunately, No Use Empty loan came along and saved my bacon. Once the development is finished, we will be putting it into the social landlords scheme, and the council will have nomination rights for putting the right or the people that they wish to see into these properties.
But is it going far enough? Housing waiting lists in the South East are amongst the worst in the country, and surely there aren't enough developers to turn all of these rundown properties into livable homes.
No Use Empty scheme has accounted, as it has, for around 1,260, 1,270 properties back into use again, for just approaching a third of the new homes that have actually been built by builders across the county. So it's a phenomenal number. It's never going to be enough, and we hope that certainly by publicising the scheme, more people will take it up. There's certainly enough money. We have the capacity to do more than we are at the moment.
Even though the government has put money aside for reviving empty homes, they are proposing cuts to some housing benefits, which will mean that many tenants will get less help with their rent. And some critics are worried that this will result in poorer people having no choice but to leave the south, where rents are higher, and move up north. So, will the lack of affordable housing price people out of the South East?
Helen Drew with that report. Well, let's pick up with that precise point. Brian Johnson, will people be forced out of the South East because of a lack of affordable housing?
I think it's unlikely. I think it's going to be a big problem in the middle of London. I think affordability of homes in the middle and north of London will be a challenge. I think in the South East we need to be very conscious, though, of the importance of housing to economic growth, and really need to make sure that the housing we provide stimulates the South East economically. I think that's more of the issue for the South East.
OK, well, there's been a dramatic change in the way that local authorities are persuaded to provide housing. Mark Reckless, your government didn't want the top-down approach anymore. They didn't want regional targets. And instead, you've come up with the new home bonus scheme. Now, for a specific moment, let's just look at whether or not it's possible that... Do you think councils should be paid to bring back empty housing, that they should get this incentive that's being offered for new houses, get it for an empty house as well?
Well, I think councils should share in the benefits of growth for their area, and it just hasn't worked trying to do everything from the centre. And I think this new approach of giving councils an incentive to support new building of homes in their area, you know, where appropriate, is a good one. And I think certainly the suggestion of seeing whether we could extend at least part of that bonus to bringing empty homes back into use, certainly I think that's something worth exploring.
Tracy, the idea behind the new homes bonus is you'd get 6 years worth of council tax paid for every new house that you created. Is that enough of an incentive? I mean, I read somewhere yesterday someone described it as bribes for NIMBYs.
I think it is an incentive in certain areas. I think somewhere like Ashford, where we've embraced the growth agenda and we are building new homes, it's a good incentive, and hopefully it will work. We've yet to see the details of it completely. It's in consultation at the moment. I think it's very difficult in some parts of Kent where it's very difficult to build, and is that incentive enough to enable somewhere like Sevenoaks to be able to build houses where the green belt is a big restriction on growth. So I think it works in some areas, but it may not work in other areas.
Is it time to rethink the green belt? Brian, what do you think?
I think Greenbelt's part of the solution potentially. I do agree though with Tracy that
well, certain areas, she was saying, places like Sevenoaks are going to struggle to find the land, even with the best will in the world, if they wanted additional building.
Absolutely, and I think that's really the challenge with the new system that's been proposed, is that places like Sevenoaks are really going to struggle to develop with that sort of a bonus. And certainly as a housing association, one of our concerns at the moment is which local authorities are we going to be able to work with to deliver new homes in the future, and where's it going to become more difficult?
So you've got some housing local authorities that show you the love a bit more than others, have you?
I wouldn't put it quite that way. I think there are some like Ashford which are very, very keen on development and make it easy. There are others where it is more challenging. I think the new proposals may make it more challenging.
Okay, we've talked a lot about building new homes and the shortage of housing. Let's talk about what happens if you are currently in social housing or in the private rented sector. Mark Reckless, there's been a lot of criticism about whether or not your government has properly evaluated the impact of the changes to housing benefit on vulnerable people. Are you sure that people, seriously vulnerable people, pensioners, people who can't work, people who are sick, are not going to be damaged, not going to be forced out of their homes?
Well, I think it's very important that we make sure they're not. And I mean, to take one example in this area, is where you're having a single room in a house. Until now, anyone over sort of 25 has been able to apply and potentially have housing benefit to pay for a flat of their own, whereas many of my constituents, many of my friends who live in London, they're sharing houses, sharing flats with friends through their late 20s into their early 30s.
Okay, we're going to take that luxury away, but equally well for people where the local housing allowance has changed, £9 a week has been the widely mooted figure of what a lot of people will lose. Now, for perhaps the four of us sitting here, that's not a lot of money, but for people here on the Stanhope estate, put that together for a month, that's a new pair of shoes for their child to go to school.
But you're assuming that rents are going to stay as they are, and the issue is for many years we've seen rents pumped up by greatly increasing amounts of housing benefits going into the market. We've seen immigration running at hundreds of thousands rather than tens of thousands a year, which we're going to have. And I think actually a lot of the change when we start reducing these housing benefits to sensible levels is going to be felt in the amount of rent. But we do have to care for the vulnerable with this. And the example I wanted to give is if someone has been homeless and perhaps has an addiction, perhaps hasn't got a job, perhaps has been on the streets, and you've got a charity who are trying to help that person back into accommodation, there may be an issue there in terms of the difficulty of a shared tenancy, and perhaps whether for a year or two we were to give some special support to that person, that might well be something we'd want to do. We've got to do this with looking after the vulnerable, but also saving money and looking after the taxpayer.
We'll be back with Mark Reckless in a moment. I'm going to say my thank yous now to Tracy and Brian, and we're going to start looking at buying houses in the South East, because as we